Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Rail, Ag Strategy Manager with Southern Minnesota Beet Sugar Cooperative, and I'm coming to you today to initiate a three-part series on Circos release spot. This series is going to be made available to the shareholders, but also to crop consultants alike to discuss some of the results of some findings from a 2019 shareholder database. So I'm going to go ahead and try to share my screen with you, and we'll go ahead and get started with this particular presentation. As you can see, it is the Southern Minnesota Beet Sugar Circos release spot database review. I'm speaking to you on behalf of the Shareholder Innovation Committee. That's a small group of shareholders that came together to identify some problematic production issues with Southern Minnesota at Southern Minnesota Beet Sugar, and to work collaboratively with the research department in order to try to come up with sustainable and economically viable solutions to some of these particular production issues. So today we're going to be taking a look at observations from a database subset in 2019 designed to look specifically at certain shareholders' Circos release spot practices. Our intent is to try to achieve some greater success to gain Circos release spot control through the addition of additive improvements, subtle additive improvements to our technique and to certain other factors or aspects of our Circos release spot program. This particular first episode is going to be a little longer than the others, so bear with us and try and bear through this one. The other ones will be shorter because I wanted to give you a little bit of an introduction first. First thing that I would want to say as an introduction is don't be fooled by 2019, or at least the infection values that we saw in 2019. There's data, and there's quite a bit of it actually. If you go back, particularly the ones I'm citing here is in the late 90s and early 2000s, about later planted sugar beet experiencing or developing Cercospora later in the season and at a lower severity level. So 2019 certainly wasn't the crop year from a yield and performance perspective that we wanted it, but it also wasn't nearly as much in Circos release spot as we might have expected coming off of that 2018 year. And I think these types of studies go a long ways to explain why we may not have seen as much Circos release spot infection in 2019 as we might have thought. I'm certain there are other plausible reasons as well, but bottom line, we cannot allow ourselves to be lulled to sleep or become complacent based upon what we saw or dealt with in 2019. So what does this have to do with our 2020, and why am I talking about this? Well, as I talk with shareholders, I'm concerned about what I perceive to be a general lack of urgency. I think some folks believe that we didn't have as much Circos release spot in 2019 and that maybe we've got her under control. Others have told me, articulated straight out, that they believe that their Circos release spot is a problem, but there are other problems that are just as viable. And that's neither the point of this conversation, quite frankly. Bottom line is that in our short recent history, we can point out a couple of different years that have cost us tens of millions of dollars each year in Circos release spot. It certainly is a formidable obstacle for us to achieve a profitable sugar beet production year. So it needs to be something that we need to give some consideration to. We all know that we have a really reasonable decent start to this year. A lot of folks have talked about the potential of 2020. It is a critical year to all of us, not only in our sugar beet production, it's critical in all of our crop production. It's been a little bit tough out there, getting beat up on the commodity world a little bit. And whether you believe in cycles or not, it does fall into our current cycle of on and off pandemics. Generally speaking, our last couple of even years have been pretty difficult when it comes to Circos release spot. Perhaps it's because we become complacent, or maybe just maybe it is a cycle we're in where the even numbered years are a little more hot, humid, or whatever the case might be. Bottom line is we need to be completely cognizant of the potential of this disease. We need to understand that 2020 is off to a good start, and there's the earmarkings of a difficult year for Circos release spot. We've all heard of the saying, hindsight is 2020. And, you know, the saying's probably never been, and certainly never been in the history of Southern Minnesota beet sugar, more uniquely relevant than to this particular cropping season. It is the year 2020. And obviously we know that the crop has quite a bit of potential, but it's the hindsight portion, because from a Circos release spot perspective, it is very likely going to be our ability to recall our very recent past, the epidemics of 2016 and 2018, that are going to determine our ability to obtain success in 2020. Don't get caught up with all the data here. The bottom line is if we look at weather data that relate to the epidemic years of 2016 and 2018, I assure you that 2020 has the earmarkings of a good year, but also a year where we might need to be on top of this Circos release spot earlier than we might normally be. Let's face it, in a pandemic or an epidemic disease infection year, we cannot have anyone that's insufficient in getting control. If we have a field that blows up the Circos release spot, being that it is a social disease, we all know that it has the potential to become the typhoid Mary and infect other fields in the proximity. And not one of us wants to be that guy. So let's make sure that we're on top of this thing right from the get-go. And potentially we have some opportunity to get some ideas to you from what we learned last year in our agronomic practice database with this small group of shareholders to give you some ideas for some modifications you might take to the field in 2020. Here's my disclaimer before we get into the data. Caution ahead. Database derived data is headed your way. It is going to be database info that we will be reviewing, and we all need to know that it is wild and untamed. There's no replication, and there's very little statistics you can do to database information to determine whether or not it's significant or has the potential to be significant from an economic perspective to your operation. We also need to know that it represents just 1 year of data, and that was 2019. Therefore, the data is entirely weighted upon the particular nuances and circumstances of 2019, which we know was not what most of us would call your typical year for various reasons. And then the subset of data is even smaller than the main agronomic practice database because there were only a certain number of shareholder operations that participated. So the field limited information is certainly limited from which to make broad scale recommendations and or operational changes. However, I think with proper interpretation and a relative amount of discerning, it does provide us a tip of the iceberg level of strategic information for us to consider to implement into our operation. So here's my disclaimer. You need to respect the data for what it is, quite frankly, for what it isn't, and make decisions only after giving it a significant level of discernment. All of the potential modifications based upon this data must be subjected to a conscious and deliberate assessment of the risk-benefit ratio to your particular operation. And then, if you determine that you want to adopt a program modification, then we need to do so in a progressive and stepwise approach. What I mean by that is to make a broad scale, wide open, several different changes to your operation. At the end of the season, regardless of what your results might be, it's very difficult to tell you which particular change that you made resulted in the particular yield or quality that you ended up at the end of the season. So choose your modifications carefully and make those modifications so that we can adjust in the following season. I also want to mention that the data that it represents basically a report to you of the results that we had summarized from 2019. There is no particular endorsements, nor are they intended for this particular data set until we get more data as accumulated, and we do intend to do so in 2020 and perhaps beyond if we need to. If there's one thing that I'd like to have you keep top of mind as you listen to the data being presented to you, and that is leaf coverage. If there is a particular theme among all of the notable sorts, it would have been those practices that increase the odds of successful deposition of fungicides to the leaf surface. So keep the theme of leaf coverage on your top of mind. Now, disclaimers aside, does any of this really matter? Well, I emphatically say yes. I think we can achieve some success through the additive, through even several small improvements or changes through the additive improvements. As it turns out, if you think about it, we don't really have many other alternatives. We still have the same basic fungicide active ingredients. We have the same basic program and spray intervals, and we more than likely have more or less the same budget that goes towards our disease control. So quite frankly, there isn't a lot of other options we have, and then try to incorporate a couple of novel ideas and try to increase the odds of getting an upper hand on this particular disease. Now, the data, I thought, kind of naturally categorized itself into 3 bins. So The three sections or the three parts of the series that I'm going to present to you have to do with these particular topics. The first one that we'll talk about today eventually is the spray day recommendations. Those are what Mother Nature throws at us day to day and what we can do to potentially be prepared for whatever she throws at us. There are also those potential modifications we can make to equipment. These are the things that we can be thinking about right now so that when we hit the field, we already know what we're going to be doing or already have it in place. And then finally, there's technique. And that's why we need to understand Mother Nature and know what we're going to do when she throws us a curveball. And we need to know our equipment, because when you hit the field that particular day, what you do with technique is what you need to be laser focused on to make sure that we are covering every aspect and doing the best we can with everything we do from a technique perspective. Ultimately, it is up to you to consider your operation and equipment and decide those specific opportunities that make sense to you and to your particular operation. But recognize that we may really not need to do a tremendous amount of change in any one particular operation to take this disease out of its comfort zone and start to win a few decisive battles. And 2020 is a decisive battle. If we take a look at the distribution of the fields of those cooperators that helped us, there were 35 cooperator operations that assisted us. And that's admirable, because many of these operations did their main agronomic practice database as well. It constituted 157 fields. I personally walked those 157 fields as much as I could to give us a Circos leaf spot score, which will become part of what we report upon. If you take a look at the map, you can start to see the cross section. I hope you can see the dots from the fields. Here's Renville. So north of the Minnesota River, we get a pretty good cross section of the core growing part of the growing area. We also got some representation up here in the irrigated areas of the Bonanza Valley, and then of course some fields that drop south of the Minnesota River as well. So pretty good cross section of the growing area. The shareholders then input all of their field data and all of their Circos leaf spot practices. And again, hats off to those guys. All of the fields were visited by me and rated to obtain firsthand observation to relate the results, the yield results, to some sort of visual observation of the success of the program. At this point, it would be prudent and of course, the right thing to do to thank those cooperators that assisted. I'm not going to go through these one by one, but thank you very much to all these cooperators for taking the time. Some of this was quite laborious. I actually asked them to try and help me to get an estimation of the pH of their spray tank and spray water temperature. So these were kind of difficult tasks, not just record keeping. And of course, I would be remiss if I did not mention Jody Steffel, who helps us to put together the Survey 123 application for everyone to populate their information, and then helps me to summarize the data so that we can present it to you today. All right, I think we're ready to start getting into some of the data. I don't think that any pathological or disease discussion should start without some discussion of the disease triangle. My concern of the disease triangle is most people talk about it or use it as an analogy or an example. They use a stool, a three-legged stool, and indicate that in order to control the disease, you need to remove or obliterate one of the legs of the stool. When all reality, the legs of the stool being the viable pathogen, the conducive environment, and the susceptible host are more than likely all experiencing a sliding curve of relative conduciveness to the disease. And when they all get conducive at the same time, that's when this area in the middle, the severity of our Circos leaf spot, can get quite severe. But understand that we do not need to eliminate any of these. In fact, it's very unlikely that we ever will, right? We cannot eliminate any of the legs, but all we can do is modify certain conditions or environments such that small changes can drastically reduce the severity of the disease. You know, just like death and taxes, Circos leaf spots here. It's one of the factors. It's one of the givens in life. We're not going to go a year without Circos leaf spot. And if we did, when we had fungicide, good, decent, effective fungicides in the past, those days are behind us. Now the best we can do is manage the Circos leaf spot into levels that allow us to maintain profitability. Bottom line, we're going to utilize this database information to search for opportunities for summation of small amendments capable of making major improvements, but everyone, it is going to require some attention to detail. With that, let's jump into part one. That would include the spray day opportunities. That's part one of 3 in the series, okay? So let's go back to that disease triangle for a second. If I might note, if you look down here at the host, I want you to know that in the upcoming years, I think I've been told, but that between the next 3 to 5 years, we will have some pretty highly resistant genetics, okay? So headed to the field, we're gonna have a jump on the disease because we're gonna have some disease genetics or disease resistance bred right in to our sugar beet plants that we're growing. However, based upon what we have under our control today in 2020, we're gonna be focusing much of our attention on the pathogen and trying to alter or take advantage of our environment in order to take the disease out of its comfort zone. If you take a look at the disease triangle from a different perspective based upon those two portions that we can control, that being the pathogen and environment, I want you to beg you to consider a different disease triangle. This time, of those things that we can control, we can break about into spray environment, we can break it out into our equipment and to our technique with the interest of trying to reduce the amount of Cercospora that occurs into some sort of manageable level where we can be economically viable, okay? If you notice the acronym, I am rather acronymic, anyone who knows me, is spray environment, equipment, and technique spell the word set. So I'm gonna ask you to get set for success, all right? If we can hone in on these three particular environments or these three particular factors, spray day, equipment, and technique, we have the opportunity to make some subtle modifications to our program and to obtain success. All right, first one, we need to talk about our Cercospora leaf spot rating. And most of the data that we're going to be talking about, I'm going to be talking about the ratings that I took out in the field. It is the KWS rating. That goes from a category 1 to a category 9. Category 9 is not where we want to be. Category 1 has 1 to 5 spots. So that is the succession or the linear progression of the disease that we'll be utilizing to assess the effectiveness of any given factor in our program. All right, getting started with the data. A lot of the slides are going to look similar, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the first one. Spray day. Let's talk about time of day. The title of the slide, or the title of the data graph, is influence of the average time of application on fungicide program performance. Okay, we have two y-axes in this case. We have the revenue per acre given on the right y-axis in dollars, and then we have the Cercospora leaf spot rating. That is the rating that we just discussed in the previous slide, relating from 1 to 9, 9 being most severe. Along the x-axis is going to be the variable that we are assessing. So in this case, oh, and I might mention, the numbers in all of the slides represented here in the black numbers are the number of fields that represent each particular data point. So if we take a look at the influence of spray date or spray timing, we can see that the highest revenue was achieved from making applications in the morning, and then it reduced as we went into midday and relatively leveled off, came up a little bit. And what's interesting is there was a very, very nice relationship to the Cercospora leaf spot rating, which also happened to be the lowest in the morning and peaked, or started, and then went up at around noon and then leveled off for the rest of the day. I might note that these are average timings. Most people sprayed 5 to 7 times. So some of these that were sprayed in the morning that are represented by spraying in the morning, some of them may actually been sprayed at least one time during the 6 or 7 applications in the afternoon, but the average was represented by a morning application. This certainly seems to indicate that we have better Cercospora leaf spot control and highest opportunity for revenue in the morning hours. I'm not going to get into the reasons why until we talk about some of the additional data that I'll talk about in the next couple of slides. If we take a look at air temperature, the first point that I want to make is that from a Cercospora leaf spot rating perspective, I did not see a visual difference in the field, all right? But I'm still going to talk about it because when we take a look at the revenue per acre down here in the graph, you can see the revenue per acre on the y-axis and the different air temperatures across the bottom. We can see that generally speaking, we increased our opportunity for revenue, higher revenue per acre with the lower air temperature. Now, if we take this in combination with the time of day, perhaps there's a relationship that with lower temperatures in the morning hours, we're getting less evaporation of our fine spray droplets and getting an opportunity to get greater coverage. Again, it's important to note that we did not see a visual difference, but it may be there is a relationship of this higher revenue per acre with the opportunity to have less evaporation of our sprays in the morning hours, okay? And that's represented here in the revenue per acre. Wind, another environmental factor that we deal with most every day. Again, Sir cost per leaf spot rating on the y-axis and wind speed from low to high as you go left to right. Again, this is average wind speed. This is averaged across all of the applications. And as you can see, here we have generally our lowest Sir cost per leaf spot ratings at the lower wind. So when you take all of these first three factors together, time of day would be in the morning where we'd have the lowest air temperature and, generally speaking, in our neck of the woods, the lowest wind. So the probability that these three factors are related is fairly high. I think that this is some reasonably different correlations here, R-squared values for agronomic practice database information. And I think there is some opportunity here to utilize certain times of day to obtain the types of conditions we want to maximize a fungicide. Again, I want to remind you that the base data did not go below 4 miles per hour for wind speed, because across 5 to 7 applications, there were no fields that had an average wind speed of lower than 4 when you averaged them across all the applications. I also want to mention that at least some of the fungicide guides, in this case, Michigan State University, will suggest that there is a certain amount of wind that you want, because it helps you to get your droplet movement to do certain things that helps you to get better coverage down into the canopy. So it's not necessarily ideal to have a zero wind speed at either. If we look at 2019 just alone and look at ideal spray conditions, just how daunting this is, there were 13 spray days in 2019 that possessed a mean wind speed of 3 miles per hour or less. Of these days, by my figures, there were only about 6 days where we had that 3 mile per hour wind or less that were dry enough to actually support a ground rig sprayer. You know, that's one ideal spray day every 17 days on average. Considering our intervals are 10 to 12 to 10 to 14 days, that means that we're not going to be able to spray ideal conditions every time we go out into the field. We also know that avoiding windy conditions is going to be difficult in our part of the world. That's why we must pay attention to all of the other options and opportunities to spray at certain times of the day to get out of the wind as best that we can. One more factor that we looked at was water temp. Had these folks all go out and take a temperature on their water. So here is the influence of average water temp on Sir cost per leaf spot fungicide efficacy. Here's the CLS rating and the different ranges of water temp. Okay. First of all, I did want to bring to your attention that one is quite low. There were only 2 operations that represented this particular 9 fields. They were influenced by deposition aids, not an endorsement necessary for deposition aids, but both of them may have been utilizing certain other factors that allowed them to get better control that were not related to water alone. But the bottom line is the trend. Generally speaking, it appears that we can get lower Sir cost per leaf spot ratings with warmer water. Perhaps not logistically possible with very many large operations. Nonetheless, it is a truism that some of these fungicides do require some reactions to take place so that the molecule becomes more fungicidal. If we have warmer water, generally speaking, that speeds up some of these chemical reactions and may have something to do with the increased activity. Lastly, I want to talk about spray pH. And when I talk about spray pH, I'm going to cite some literature. First of all, here's the fungicide guide that I was talking to you about. It's the Michigan State Fruit Management Guide. It happens to be 2019 in this particular year. And they have a really nice section on fungicides, one of the nicer university brochures that I've seen. And in this case, I want to bring to your attention half-life, okay? Half-life is defined as the period of time it takes for 1/2 of the amount of pesticide in the water to degrade, usually through some sort of hydrolysis reaction. They mentioned diethane, that's a brand name, but particularly what I want to hone in on is mancozeb, because that is the backbone of our current Sir cost per leaf spot fungicide program at Southern Minnesota Beet Sugar. And they list the half-life of mancozeb at a pH of 7 to be about 17 hours long before half of it has degraded. At a pH 5, they designate it as 20 days long. That's over 25x increase in half-life through reducing the pH from a 7 to a 5. That could be considerable. One of the questions that people ask is, well, I don't keep my product in the tank for 20 some hours or even 24 days or 20 days. Bottom line is even when we spray it onto the leaf, there are some hydrolysis reactions that are going on. So more than likely, pH is going to assist us even once we leave the sprayer and end up deposited on the sugar beet leaf. The fungicide guide, the Michigan State Fungicide Guide, goes on to say if you know that your water has a pH of 7.5 or greater, you should consider lowering the pH, especially if you are applying a pesticide that is sensitive to high pH, which we are in the case of the Mancozeb products. When we look at the shareholder database information on pH, you can see it's another pretty nicely fit line, R squared of 0.71. And generally speaking, the trend is that for higher pH, just as Michigan State's documentation would have suggested, we generally have worse cost release spot scores. The lower the score, the lower the pH, down to less than 6.5. So there may be some significant low-hanging fruit value of finding ways to generally reduce our pH of our spray solution. One caveat I want to warn folks about is that let's just make sure that we're not throwing products into the tank willy-nilly that have the potential to offset some other desirable trait that we're trying to do, perhaps with a adjuvant or spray additive. We need to make sure that we're utilizing specific pH adjustment products that are designed to reduce the pH without altering other more beneficial aspects of your spray solution. If you have any questions, you should certainly contact your agriculturist, and they should be able to help you with the decisions that are needed to make for the products that you could use to reduce the spray pH of your cost release spot spray solution. To summarize the finality of part one of our series of 3 on spray day factors that we can try to influence, I think it would go something like this: dealing with a regimented spray schedule and a variable climate can make looking for opportunities with spray environment very difficult. We cannot adjust Mother Nature. All we can do is adjust to Mother Nature. However, there may be options available to alter our spraying sequence or even our timing when it relates to high-risk fields or fields that are showing heavy symptomology. So although we can't change Mother Nature, we can deal with her if we have our plan in place and figure out ways to alternate fields. Bottom line, this is the end of the first part of our series. I would like to welcome you for part 2, where we're going to discuss more in depth equipment opportunities. Until then, Steve Rail, we'll talk with you later. Thank you.